Hello, this is Dr. Aldwin Ragunan. This is my third subject on Pentecostal preaching. In this subject, we'll have probably 3 lectures. But before I get into the subject of the different types of sermons Pentecostal preach, I want to give some introductory remarks. One of the big problems among those who preach and teach preaching is to insist that their method is the right method and all other methods are not right. In my research, I have found that it is better to speak about principles and concepts in terms of types of sermons than just limiting oneself to a book knowledge of the definition and types of preaching. I think that preaching is very fluid, and there are certain principles that need to be kept in mind. First of all, where do we as Christians get our model of preaching? One can say it's the prophets, the preaching of the prophets, the preaching of Jesus and Paul. However, we do not see these exemplified in Scripture, except that Jesus was in a synagogue and participated in a synagogue service and the Sermon on the Mount. The closest thing that I could find to where we got a model of preaching is the synagogue. In the very beginning, Christians were considered part of Judaism. And what a lot of scholars believe is that since they came from a Jewish background, they followed the synagogue form of worship. And in the synagogue form of worship, people got together in small communities, and later on there would be buildings. And there is a difference between the synagogue and the temple. The temple was the central place where the high priest operated, and where main celebrations took place. And this was in Jerusalem. But a synagogue was little communities or little churches where people met for worship on the Sabbath day. There are 2 or 3 things that are important to remember in the synagogue service. First of all, it was for people in the community. They read Scripture, one from the prophets, and one from the law being the first 5 books of the Bible. And then there was a short sermon. This is what we see as the foundation of the methodology of Christian preaching. It follows the example of translating Scripture. It follows the tradition of explaining what that Scripture meant. And thirdly, it meant to explain that scripture that was read to the congregation so that people understood what was being said. Now, when I was studying preaching, one of the persons I studied under is Dr. Peterser from the University of South Africa. And in his book called Communicative Preaching, he did a survey of preaching in his country and, as far as I remember, in Holland. Since he is from the Reformed tradition, he wanted to find out the state of preaching and the type of preaching that was going on and how effective they were. And so he went about it by doing a qualitative and quantitative analysis. And the way he categorized sermons to be analyzed is one, he categorized sermons into three categories: scripturally oriented sermons, situationally oriented sermons, and topically oriented sermons. I think this is wide enough to guide our discussion. Scripturally oriented sermons are sermons that are very biblical. It is so biblical that there is hardly any application in it, and it is very true to the text in Hebrew and Greek, but very poor on application. So it meant that they were speaking scripture only with little or no application. Then the other division he made, or a category, is situationally oriented sermons. Situationally oriented sermon is the opposite of scripturally oriented sermons. Situationally oriented sermons has to do with sermons that is most concerned in communicating truth to a congregation with very little reference or biblical content. And the third one is topically oriented sermon. And he said, this is probably the best sermon. Topically oriented sermon has to do with a mixture of scripture and the application. So it took scripture and applies it to the congregation. So it is speaking to the congregation. I like this because it has a good mixture of the Bible and the situation. Now, preaching, I believe, should be from the Bible, but it also should speak to people where they are in their situation today. So that is a very important thing to keep in mind. The third thing I would like to say is, as I have looked at preaching, the most important thing I believe preaching should have is a sermon should be Christocentric, whether it is from the Psalms or Songs of Solomon or the book of Acts. It must always speak about Jesus Christ. And it might start with a sermon, as in a textual or expository sermon. It might not start with a scripture, but it should intertwine scripture in its presentation. So although one might speak about worry for example. It must speak about what the Bible talks about and bring in present-day situation and show how Jesus and the Scripture deals with worry. I hope this provides a good introduction for us as we get into the different types of preaching. Thank you very much.